All right, can we get started? Because I'm on a break from a jury trial, but I did want to come today to reintroduce my friend and former colleague, Prof Schindler, because he's going to do his second program today. And I didn't get to introduce him the first time because of work-related matters, but I told the jury yesterday already that I was going to break at 11:30 so I could do it today. For those of you who were able to hear Devin last time, I should say Professor Schindler, I guess, I think you can tell he's so in love with this material. He understands it at a level that allows him to present it to you in a storytelling way that I think is interesting to people who are lawyers and non-lawyers alike. I mean, I've known about Marbury versus Madison at least since college, I suppose, and certainly more since law school, but hearing you tell a story again in all its human detail not only makes the point more forceful, it makes it much more entertaining. And I wish I could stay to hear what you're going to say today, because that's going to be a perfect segue into, I think it's next week's program, right?
Next week we're going to have a guest speaker coming from the former from FJC.
And you're going to get right into the heart of Antietam and some of the Civil War things. And then when we're all together in Washington, we hear from our speaker on Justice Marshall, who argued, as a lawyer, the Brown v. Board decision that opened the door to unsegregated schools. That you couldn't ask for a better bridge today. I thought I'd tell a quick story about Devin. I don't know if you even remember it, and I probably remember it wrong. But
should I leave now?
So, we started at Warner probably within the same 2 days, as I recall. I don't remember it.
You came 4 days before me because you wanted to be senior in the class. Yes.
Exactly. Warner was a seniority-based place, so depending on when you walked in the door, you got your office pick, you got your letterhead position, and all of that. So I did definitely want to make sure I got there before that. That's the difference between a trial court law clerk and an appellate court law clerk. Right? A trial court is always on the ground, thinking of those details. But we had so much fun together, and one of the earliest things we worked on, and really not knowing each other, not having worked together before, but coming together, was something called the Rose Patch litigation, which was proxy litigation between, some of you who've been here a long time remember it, right? And probably remember it differently than we do. But it came up early on a preliminary injunction, so everybody's really edgy. The other people we represented, Rose Patch in the case, wanted to stop the annual meeting. They didn't want something to go forward. And so we had a preliminary injunction hearing with, I think it was Judge Hill.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, okay. And so Devin and I are tasked with writing a whole bunch of stuff really fast.
3 hours.
Okay.
Jay Craigwell came into our office at 9 o'clock and said you have 3 hours to file a brief. Yes.
But we did it and got it over, and we're pretty proud of it. And we came over, and I'm sitting there, and I don't remember if it was I who asked you or you who asked me, but do you shepherdize those cases? And for those of you who aren't lawyers, shepherdizing cases is what we used to call it. Now you call it key cite. You're testing the case law you cite to see if it's been overturned or in some way dinged by later courts. And I hadn't done it. You hadn't done it. And the brief is there, and we're thinking, oh my God. Well, we found out later our senior lawyer, Jay Craigwell, had seen to that on his own. So we were both spared for that. But that was really one of the beginning that we probably played that out over and over years, where there'd be some crisis, and we'd work together. And you all know that working together in crisis is what tends to form lasting bonds of friendship. So I'm really glad that he's willing to do this. This is all on his time. It's all extra for him. We're not paying him anything. You get, our adulation, which is wonderful, but nothing else. And of course, he's got a full docket as a professor, plus ongoing work as a private lawyer. Warner still does work for some of their clients. So we can't give you money. We can't give you anything but our adulation. But through our clerk of court, Tom Dorwin, we did arrange to get you a commemorative coin, which some of you who've seen Don Davis talk will recognize, right? He's still selling it. Tom paid for it, no government funds were spent for it. And I'm going to reimburse him. But I hope we'll give you a sense of access and affection to the Western District of Michigan.
Wildly honored.
Great.
It's dangerous to give the speech before the speech.
And thank you for coming. I wish you could join us on the trip, but hopefully, we're putting this all on YouTube, right? Aren't we? So we can watch it over and over.
I don't think we'll get many hits or likes, but thank you.
So thanks again for coming. I'm going to leave Devin with you, and I'll have to watch it on YouTube.
I am smiling and laughing because I was walking over here contemplating whether I should have told that exact story that Joe just told. And I'll wait till he leaves to tell you the rest of the story. I turned to Judge Yonker and said, I assume you did the site check, and he went, no, I assume you did the site checking. Now, the great thing about working with Judge Yonker is I tend to be a little more histrionic than he is, more of an, I don't know, emotional is the wrong word, but certainly more highly strung. And you have, Judge Yonker, happy. Judge Yonker, unhappy. Judge Yonker realizing no one had site checked the brief. That was about the extent of it. I was concerned for years after. I'd forgotten that Jay Craig had already site checked the brief for us. But for years afterwards, I was concerned when the time came that during Judge Yonker's confirmation hearings, the first question would be, now, isn't it true you filed a brief without making sure it was a good law firm? me with egg on my face. But I am honored again to be here. I'm honored to talk about one of my favorite topics, three of my favorite topics. Abraham Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War. I'm truly in hog heaven right now. These are three things that I've studied and very much enjoyed talking about. I've been to many of the battlefields. I am wildly jealous that all of you get to go to Antietam, which is just a spiritual place. That you are very lucky to have this opportunity. But when I think about the Civil War, I don't think about it in terms of history. When I think about the Civil War, I think about how it continues to resonate here in 2018. Because for me, the Civil War never ended. For me, the battles we fought at the Civil War continue to strain our society and continue to help us define what it means to be an American. Because for me, the Civil War and what came after it was what I call the second constitutional revolution, where we redefined the relationship between the federal government and the states, what we call in my business federalism, where we redefined what our view was of presidential powers, a topic that we hear about every day, driving over this morning, thinking about the Civil War and hearing about the potential actions in Syria. It redefined the civil liberties that we all hopefully enjoy. And in many ways, the Civil War, the second constitutional revolution, redefined what it means to be an American. This is what I call the second constitutional revolution. We begin our discussion with a snapshot in time. The year is 1856. At this point, the Bill of Rights, where we look to see so many of our rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from establishment, didn't apply to the states. The states were free to take away your free speech rights. If Utah wanted to declare Mormonism the national religion, the state religion, I should say, they could do it. The Bill of Rights did not protect you from the states. It was up to the states to protect you. Now, time to time, the students ask me, why is it? Why didn't the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, why didn't they apply to the states? And I have them open up their Constitution, and I have them read the first line, and they say, well, Congress shall make no law. In the original structure of our Constitution, it wasn't the federal courts that defined and protected your civil rights. It wasn't the federal government that defined and protected your civil rights. It was up to the states. How did that work out for us? Some debate on this, but in 1856, the courts, the federal courts, were not in the business of recognizing unenumerated fundamental liberty rights. Things like right to terminate pregnancies, right to birth control, right to care custody control. It was up to the states to define your civil liberties and not federal courts. The states, and not the Constitution, and not the federal government, defined what it meant to be an American living in a free society. I use this graphic. I call this the power pie. I want you to envision all things political power: the power to tax, the power to spend, the power to enslave, the power to kill, and put it into this pie. The founders said, we are going to take this pie, and in order to better secure liberty, put it into slices. and we'll give the federal government a tiny little slice, all written down in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution. But what we don't give to the federal government in these tiny slices of pie, we will leave to the states. And so under the original Constitution, the states, and not the federal government, had the majority of the political power, with a tiny little bit left to the people and a tiny bit of left to the federal government. We're going to come back to this slide. But the original constitutional picture was to allow the states to define what it meant to be an American. All of this began to change in essentially 3 cases and 1 proclamation, all of which helped define what it means to be an American in 2018, and all of which fomented a constitutional revolution. So what I'm going to do during the next 45 minutes or an hour or so is take you through these 3 incredibly important cases and 1 important proclamation, and hopefully give you some sense of why I personally think the Civil War, the Acts of Lincoln, and 3 famous cases fundamentally rewrote our Constitution and fundamentally changed what it means to be an American. The first case is without doubt, the most infamous case in the history of the United States Supreme Court and the worst decision in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Despite my tremendous respect for the federal judiciary, sometimes they get it wrong. And here's one they got it way wrong. This gentleman in the corner, his name is Dred Scott. Mr. Scott, his history is somewhat unknown, lost in sort of the sea of history, but was a slave. He was owned by an army surgeon. Army surgeon would be placed in various military bases. Now, from all accounts, this army surgeon that quote-unquote owned Mr. Scott was a bit of a ne'er-do-well and an alcoholic. Had a hard time keeping a job. And so for a period of time, he was placed in a fort in Illinois. He brought Mr. Scott with him. Of course, Illinois is above a line known as the Mason-Dixon line. Pursuant to a federal statute, the Missouri Compromise, some of you probably have heard of that, every state or territory north of this line was considered free. Every state below this line was considered slave. So for a period of time, Mr. Scott and his quote-unquote owner lived in a free state. Couldn't keep a job. The army surgeon got in trouble with his local commander, and so they shipped him off to the hinterlands of the Wisconsin Territory, specifically Minnesota. Put him out in the cold where he can't get much trouble. He brought with him Mr. Scott. In Minnesota, Mr. Scott got married, ultimately had 4 children. And so the army surgeon now not only owned Mr. Scott, but also owned Mr. Scott's quote-unquote wife, or owned, quote-unquote, owned his wife and the 4 children. Spent a period of time in Minnesota. Under the laws at the time, there was a doctrine called once free, always free. That if your quote-unquote owner took you beyond the Mason-Dixon line, as a matter of state and federal law, you are now free and free forever. Eventually, my near-dear-well army surgeon got placed in Missouri, a slave state. Whereupon, with the help of some very pro bono attorneys, and I love pro bono attorneys for this case among others, some very good pro bono attorneys, backed by the abolitionist movement, took Mr. Scott's case, sued in state court under the once free, always free doctrine to free him, his wife, and his 4 children. The case made its all the way up to the Missouri Supreme Court, where Mr. Scott lost. Not to be undone, these pro bono attorneys filed again in federal district court under diversity of citizenship. As many of you know, federal court has limited jurisdiction. Some of the cases they can hear is when a citizen of one state sues a citizen of another state. Mr. Scott claimed to be a citizen of the state of Missouri. His then owner was a citizen of New York. By this time, the army surgeon had died. His wife had sold Mr. Scott to a fella by the name of Sanford in New York. There's a lot of evidence that this was a setup case, that in fact both sides were working towards the same end, which was to get Mr. Scott free and to make part of federal law the once free, always free doctrine. This may have been a setup case, we don't really know, but nonetheless, the case is filed in the Missouri Federal District Court. He loses, makes its way up to the United States Supreme Court, where the United States Supreme Court, led by a Chief Justice by the name of Roger Taney, or Taney, Roger, I've heard it pronounced either way, Roger Taney, a Southerner, up to this point had been somewhat of a nondescript Chief Justice, got the case. 3 issues. Is Mr. Scott a citizen of the state of Missouri? And therefore, can he invoke diversity jurisdiction? 2, is Mr. Scott even a citizen? Or for that matter, even a person? Trees can't sue, property can't sue. And 3rd, is the Missouri Compromise constitutional? Because the proponents of slavery wanted the Missouri Compromise struck down. All 3 of these issues came before the Supreme Court. And what is without doubt the worst decision in the history of the United States Supreme Court, Mr. Scott lost on all 3 arguments. Now let's put this in context. In 1856, we had bloody Kansas. We had the fight over Missouri, whether it should be a slave state. The intersectional battle over slavery was tearing our country apart. Something had to be done. President Buchanan had just been elected. President Buchanan desperately wanted to avoid the whole slavery issue. And so, weeks before this case came out, he gave his inaugural address. And in the context of the inaugural address, he said the following: slavery is happily a matter of but little practical importance. It is a judicial question, which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court of the United States, before whom it is now pending, and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally settled. The President kicked it over to the courts to decide what to do with the slavery question. A reflection of what great respect folks had for the courts even at the time. One of the little tidbits of history is Buchanan knew how the case was going to come out. Taney had leaked the decision to him. So at the time he gave the speech, he was aware that the Supreme Court was about to rule the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. A few weeks after, the opinion comes out. And the horror of this opinion scarcely needs to be repeated, but I'll repeat it anyways. I use the term African Americans, but of course I shouldn't, because that's not how the court saw it. They saw it as slaves. Slaves were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution. On the contrary, they were at that time considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings. And on this opinion went, saying that these folks are not even people. They are in fact property. Therefore, slaves can't be citizens of a state, just like property can't be a citizen of a state. They're not even citizens of the United States, because of course property can't be a citizen. Therefore, no jurisdiction. The court had no authority to hear the case. Now, for those of you who worked in the judiciary, as soon as the court decides it doesn't have jurisdiction, the case is over, right? Not for Justice Taney. He went on and in pure dicta ruled that the Missouri Compromise, that at least freed half our country, was unconstitutional because it deprived slaveholders of their fundamental right to purchase and own property. Full stop. Well, did President Buchanan's hope be realized? Did that stop the intersectional conflict over slavery? Of course not. In my perspective on this, Dred Scott was the fuse that led to the conflagration that became the Civil War, the bloodiest and most horrific war in the history of the United States, at least I would argue. Well, ultimately, thank God for history, the North won. More draft picks, little home field advantage. Nonetheless, the North won. But now we had a challenge. Having won the war, what do we do about the Dred Scott opinion? Because remember, once a court, a federal court or the United States Supreme Court makes a constitutional decision, that is the law of the land. Congress can't overturn a constitutional decision because of 2 weeks ago, Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter. And having decided that slaves were property and therefore not citizens nor people, that was still on the books, notwithstanding the Emancipation Proclamation, which we will revisit in about 38 minutes. Nonetheless, we had a challenge. First, slaves are property. Well, to overturn the Dred Scott opinion, we had to adopt the 13th Amendment, making slavery and indentured servitude unconstitutional. It takes a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court. How did the South respond to this? Did they freely give up their slaves? Of course not. In another horrific period of our history, the Southern states, as they became readmitted and even before, started adopting the so-called black codes. Laws specifically designed to make sure that the newly emancipated African Americans remained in servitude. Here's a few examples for you. Louisiana. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner. Penalty of death if you're caught on the streets without the permission of your quote-unquote former owner. No Negro should be permitted to rent or keep a house within the parishes, certain parishes. The ultimate segregation in housing. The first terrorist organization, the first one, think about that. The first terrorist organization in United States history, the KKK, is formed in 1865 by former Confederate soldiers who have the goal of refighting the Civil War and ensuring that the newly emancipated African American, the freedmen, remain in their position. Untold, thousands are killed. Well, this creates a problem because under our old Constitution, the federal government has no authority to do anything about it. Because under our old Constitution, it's the states that define the rights of people. And so the federal government is sitting there going, we have no real authority to prevent the states from continuing this horrific process of continuing to enslave the folks that we fought a war over, we all fought a war over, to free. This resulted in a restructuring of our Constitution. This resulted in our second founding fathers stepping up. Now, I love it because I'll be in class, for example, my brand new students, I'll talk about, yes, our founding fathers, Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Bingham, Summers. Who the heck is Bingham and Summers? I've never heard of them before. Well, these two gentlemen and others like them, in my mind, have the same sort of role in the pantheon of great Americans as Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson. Because these are the men that said, we need to recut the power pie. We need to restructure our Constitution to ensure that the federal government has the authority to stop the destruction of civil liberties and civil rights. Congressman John Bingham from Ohio on the House side, Senator Charles Sumner, who was also a big character in the movie Lincoln, by the way, if you saw it, on the Senate side, joined together to propose a constitutional amendment known as the 14th Amendment. A little fast fact. John Bingham prosecuted the Booth conspirators. Isn't it funny on history, these people, you find them everywhere. So they've got everywhere. Charles Sumner, little fun fact, he was almost beaten to death in 1856 on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Senate, excuse me, by a pro-slavery senator. Yeah, I love it when people say to me, "Oh, politics is so nasty these days." Burr shot Hamilton, for God's sakes. Sumner got almost beat to death on the Senate floor. I mean, yeah, politics has always been rough sport, and was particularly rough sport when it came to the question of slavery, for obvious reasons. Such an impassioned issue. Nonetheless, these two gentlemen and their supporters, the radical Republicans, joined together with Lincoln, who was dead at that point, or dying, or about to die at that point. Nonetheless, came together and said, we must amend the Constitution to ensure that the individual civil liberties of people are protected from the states, which we can't trust the states to protect civil liberties. Now, you've all heard of the 14th Amendment. I won't ask for a show of hands. How many people ever sat down and read the whole thing? Well, 3 of it is about how the states get back in the Union and whatnot. But the operative parts for today's discussion Start at the beginning. All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States in the state wherein they reside. This language was necessary to overrule Dred Scott, because Dred Scott had ruled that the former slaves, now freedmen, were neither citizens of any state nor citizens of the United States. Once the Supreme Court decides, it takes a constitutional amendment or a new court for that to no longer be good law. We fought a whole civil war. Dred Scott was still technically good law. Even after the war, it took a constitutional amendment to change that. I find it curious. In 2018, there's a movement afoot to amend this. The whole, quote unquote, their words, not mine, the anchor banking issue, quote unquote. I wonder if the people that are for rewriting the 14th understand why that language is in there in the first place. The Civil War continues to sort of reverberate here in 2018. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is the big one. This is the one where termination of pregnancy, abortion rights, birth control rights, the right to care, custody, and control of your children, that we all have a liberty right to marriage equality. That should be one. Abortion, contraception, to raise your kids free from undue government influence. Now look right away what's going on. Because of 2 weeks ago, when we talked about Marbury, amending the Constitution to say that no state shall deprive you of liberty. Who gets to define liberty now? The court gets to define liberty. Hence, some of our most famous, relatively recent cases. Ogerbefell, which came out of Michigan. Marriage equality case. Roe v. Wade. Why did the court rule the way they did, or what gave the court the power to rule? Right here. Marbury versus Madison and the 14th Amendment. And then, then finally, nor shall any state deny to any person with its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, I have a 4-hour discussion of what equal protection means. If you have 4 hours, I can start now. You probably don't, so let me cut to the chase. Equal protection. Again, the court gets to decide what that means. And in 2018, the court has defined equal protection to essentially say that the government cannot discriminate based on your race, your gender, most recently your sexual orientation, alienage, legitimacy, the list goes on, without an overriding powerful government interest. Look what we just did by adopting the 14th Amendment. We've taken our power pie, and we've taken huge power away from the states. We've given it to the federal government, and more specifically, not to the entire federal government, but we've given it to folks I'm seeing right here. We've given it to the federal court system to now define what liberty means, what equality means, what your civil liberties mean. So much of the litigation we see in the social wars today come from this rewriting of the power pie, taking the power away from the states and giving it to the federal government, and specifically the federal courts. That's why I call this the second constitutional revolution. It's a whole different way of looking at how we structure a government dedicated to the proposition that people should have civil liberties and civil rights. The Civil War lives on today. On the cultural wars, we are fighting about transgender. The cultural wars, we're fighting about gay rights. The cultural wars, we're fighting about abortion. It all comes from this second constitutional revolution. Civil War, in my mind, also restructured and redefined how we think about presidential powers. Not that this is a big issue these days. And to illustrate this point, the notion that the Civil War defined and redefined how we think about presidential powers, I'm going to talk about 2 cases in specific. There's others I can talk about. At the founding, if you read the Constitution, Article 1, Article 2, and if you haven't read it, it's good reading. I've read the Constitution. I've read it a couple times last week just for the kicks. It's a good read. Article 1 talks about the powers of Congress. They are limited. Regulated interstate commerce, things of that nature. That's why if you've ever sat in a trial with the federal, a federal prosecution, at some point in time the AUSA stands up and says, and there's a connection to interstate commerce here. You're like, why? You know, this is a murder case, whatever. Congress can't regulate murder. It can regulate commerce. Point being, Article 1 tells us what the powers of Congress are, what kind of laws they can pass. Article 2 says, here's what the president can do. And basically, the only major power he gets, or she gets, other than the power of appointment, is Commander-in-Chief. One line. He or she, he, being the exact language, should be Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But you look at the list of powers given to Congress, Congress has a long list of war power. It has the power to spend for the general defense. It has the power to raise armies. It has the power to raise navies. Oh, I love this little story. If you read the Constitution, Congress has the power to raise navies in perpetuity. It only has power to raise armies for 2 years. Why would the original Constitution say that Congress only has the power to raise armies for 2 years, but the power to have a navy in perpetuity? I would be a little concerned with the despotic government of the 101st Airborne coming to my neighborhood and destroying my liberty, a standing army. I'm not too worried about a gunboat coming up the Grand River destroying my liberty. The idea that we are more concerned about standing armies than standing navies, and it takes a lot more time to raise a navy. But wait, Schindler, we've had an army forever. Yup, every 2 years Congress has to pass a new law, re-upping the military. Why? Because it's in the Constitution. The point being, if you compare the powers given to the president and you compare them to the powers given to Congress, you'll see Congress' list is much more long. It's much longer. And the idea being that Congress, as the people's representatives, should be making our laws, directing our some argument on this, but directing our foreign policy, directing our war issues. The president's job, primarily, end of the day, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. At the end of the day, the president is commander-in-chief and is told under the Constitution to do what the Congress tells him to do, or her to do. Fairly limited, if you think about it. Well, we see in the Civil War where Abraham Lincoln took that commander-in-chief power and ran with it, dramatically and forever reshaping our view of the relationship of the powers between Congress and the president. Our story begins again with the Civil War. April 15th, 1861. Actually, April 12th, 1861. The Confederates, several Confederate states, declare their sovereignty, declare themselves an independent nation, and there's the bombing of Fort Sumter. If you've never been there, it's really cool. Fort Sumter is bombed. Abraham Lincoln has a big problem. The Confederate states are seizing federal armories, taking weapons, taking arms, bombing Fort Sumter, seizing federal forts, taking federal land. Big problem. Congress is not in session. Congress won't be in session until July 4th, 1861. Abraham Lincoln is sitting on a huge crisis with no legislation allowing him to wage war. And so Abraham Lincoln does a number of things claiming commander-in-chief power. Among other things, he spent money he hadn't been authorized to spend, buying ships and buying guns. He began drafting soldiers he hadn't been authorized to bring into the military, expanded the military in a fashion he had not been authorized to do it. He declared a blockade, which under the laws at the time is a declaration of war. Wait a minute, I read the Constitution a few times last week. Only Congress can declare war. And yet here is Abraham Lincoln essentially declaring war without congressional authority. And most critically for this part of our story, Abraham Lincoln declares a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the state of Maryland. Maryland was on the cusp. You know, we had our central southern states. Everybody knew Alabama was going. Everybody knew Georgia was going. Everybody knew South Carolina was going. But we had 4 border states, Kentucky, New Hampshire, Maryland, and Missouri, that were northern leaning, but slave states. Which way are they going to go? Southern armies are being raised. Washington, D.C. the seat of our capital, is essentially undefended. There's no armies to speak of in Washington, D.C. The war could have been over in weeks if the Southerners happened to take over and invade our national capital and take it over. So immediately, Lincoln orders all available troops to make their way to Washington, D.C. Problem. To get there, they have to go through Maryland, a slave state. The governor of Maryland announces to Abraham Lincoln, because at that point the states had a lot more power than they do now, announces to Lincoln, do not bring your troops through Maryland. They are not welcome here. Abraham Lincoln goes, I need them in D.C. We're going to bring them through Maryland. Whereupon the governor orders the National Guard, the militia at the time, the state militia, to begin burning bridges and destroying rail lines to prevent Abraham Lincoln from bringing troops in to protect Washington, D.C. Can you imagine this? The governor starts to willfully destroy bridges using the National Guard to make sure that the United States Capitol could not be defended. One gentleman, Mr. Merriman, he's a state legislator and a lieutenant in the lieutenant in the Maryland militia, is out there burning bridges, destroying the rail lines, so Lincoln couldn't get his troops. He is captured by federal troops. He is locked up. To make sure that we get the troops here without any further ado, Abraham Lincoln announces, Merryman and the people like him, we're going to lock them up and throw away the key. We are not going to give a trial. There's no hearings. We are going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Thank God no president in the last 20 years has said we should lock people up without due. Oh, wait. Wait. That's still going on, isn't it? Nonetheless, the writ of habeas corpus, roughly speaking, bring me the body. It is an ancient writ and one of your fundamental constitutional rights. If the executive branch takes you, locks you up, you have a constitutional right to go to the nearest federal court and order the president, receive an order, a writ if you will, ordering the president to bring the body, to bring you into court and defend why the executive has locked you up. You get due process. Article 1 says Congress can suspend the writ in times of insurrection or invasion. The president can't do it. He did it anyways. He is locked up at Merryman. Merryman finds a lawyer. The lawyer goes, seeks a writ of habeas corpus. And guess who just happens to be riding circuit as the chief judge of Maryland at that point in the federal courts? Roger Taney, from Dred Scott fame, a Southern Chief Justice. Roger looks at this, and Roger says, orders the president to give up Mr. Merryman. I can see no ground whatever for the supposing that the president, in any emergency, that's my best Roger Taney, can authorize the suspension, nor can any argument be drawn from the nature of sovereignty or the necessity of the government for self-defense in times of tumult and danger. Translated, Lincoln, give him up. That's Scaramucci for give him up. Give him up. Well, Lincoln is arguing an ancient idea, the law of necessity. The idea that in times of great emergency, throw out the Constitution, that the president has the inherent power to do whatever is necessary to save the Union, the power to act in great emergencies. Of course, our Constitution says nothing about an emergency clause. Our Constitution says nothing about a Constitution that applies in times of war and a Constitution at times that applies in peace. It's one Constitution. Nonetheless, Abraham Lincoln argues the combination of this law of necessity, this unwritten rule, and my commander-in-chief powers gives me the absolute authority, notwithstanding what the Constitution says, to lock up Mr. Merryman without any hearing, trials, or due process. Chief Judge of the United States Supreme Court says otherwise. Says you have no authority, and frankly no authority, Mr. President, to do all the other stuff you did. Essentially declaring war by invading, imposing a blockade, essentially raising troops without any money. You don't have the money to do it. So one day after the writ issues, a poor marshal is required to go knock on the door of the fort. This literally happened. Knock on the door of the fort where Merriman has been kept. Knock, knock. Who's there? Marshal Jones. Hi, Marshal Jones. What can I do for you? Hey, I got a writ from the Chief Justice. You got to give Merriman up. Well, the president told me not to do that. Who's going to win that fight? The president refuses to turn him over. Literally at the doorstep of the fort, they told the U.S. Marshal, we are not going to give Merriman up because the president has decided that in these times of emergency, he has the authority to not do so. So for the next 3-4 months, Lincoln is doing all kinds of things under this notion of commander-in-chief gives him tremendous power, under this notion of the law of necessity, emergency situations require emergency responses, raising money, spending money, things of that nature. He's refusing to give up Merriman, notwithstanding an order from the Chief Justice to give up Merriman. Big possible constitutional crisis. But then we get lucky, or at least for historic sake, we get lucky. July 4th, Congress comes back. And Lincoln makes the following speech. I can't give a Lincoln voice. Apparently had a high-pitched voice. Anyway, these measures, whether strictly legal or not, well, they kind of weren't, but okay. Whether strictly legal or not, were ventured upon under what appeared to be popular demand and necessity. Well, let the people vote me out. Yeah, that's kind of checking on me, I suppose. If people don't like it, vote me out. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted? What's this one law he's talking about? Constitution. And the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated? I need to violate the Constitution in order to save the Constitution. Would not the official oath be broken if the government should be overthrown when it was believed that disregarding the single law would tend to preserve it? Fortunately for history, Congress voted overwhelmingly to give him authority to do everything he'd already done. Sort of ex post facto. It's all good by us. And so you eventually got authority of Congress to raise the armies and things of that nature and to suspend the writ. But at the time, I've got Chief Justice of the Supreme Court ruling Lincoln's actions unconstitutional. Dodged a big constitutional bullet at that point. But here is the ultimate point on this, and you'll see it again in a moment. To this day, every president since Lincoln, at one time or another, has talked about their inherent powers to act in emergencies. I'm kind of hearing it, echoes of this morning as I drove in listening to news radio as President Trump started talking about bombing Syria. We're not at war with Syria. Congress has never declared war against Syria. What authority does the president have to unilaterally send brave American soldiers and Air Force folks to bomb a country we're not at war at? Oh, Lincoln did it. Lincoln did it. The echoes continue. We saw this a lot 10 years ago in the War on Terror and the Guantanamo Bay and all that kind of thing. Bush was all over Lincoln. If you read his briefs and whatnot, there was a lot of Lincoln did this, War on Terror, emergency times. I have the authority to do all of this. It's on.
The microphone, the paper's on top of it.
Sorry. Nobody heard that, right? And aside, the war lives on. August 18th, 2017, Roger Taney's statue moved from the Maryland State House grounds overnight. What are we doing? I'm sorry, I shouldn't get political. What are we doing honoring this man? The man who wrote the worst opinion in the history of the United States Supreme Court. A man who ruled that slaves were not people but property. And yet the Civil War lives on and continues to resonate. We see it in the fights over the statutes, including Roger Taney's statue. And the debate goes on. I won't read all of this to you, but on September 14th, 2017, President Trump declared another emergency. Actually, he renewed an emergency. This one's been around since September of 2001, the War on Terror, granting himself emergency powers to continue to fight the war on terror. As we sit here today, there are actively 28 emergencies proclaimed by the president. Most recently, the emergency on opioids. Why do presidents like to declare emergencies all the time? Lincoln, the attack on Fort Sumter, gives them greater power. Now, in many of these cases, Congress is authorized. I'll give you that much. But we are addicted to emergencies in 2018 because it restructures presidential powers. One other that highlights my point on how the Civil War continues to resonate today and how the Civil War continues to help us define, if you will, or at least frame the debate on the nature of presidential powers, the powers of the president in times of emergency. The prize cases. So, Lincoln, as I mentioned before, decides that we're going to blockade the southern states, stop them from getting money in their cotton out and all this sort of thing. Rhett Butler's running ships back and forth and all that kind of. I think he's a fictional character, but anyway, Rhett Butler's running the ships back and forth. We're seizing those ships. A lot of the time, you seize a ship which runs a blockade, you own it now. So the United States has seized a number of ships. Well, what do we do with these ships? We'd take them up to New York and we'd auction them off. The United States would take the proceeds. Ship owners, out of luck. They don't see a penny of that money. It all goes to the government because they have violated the law, is the argument, and therefore they basically don't have any claim to their property anymore. 4 ships are seized. These ships are taken up to New York. These are prizes of war, hence the prize cases. The ship owners stand up in court and say, you cannot seize my property because the blockade is unconstitutional. Lincoln's blockade. Now, foreshadowing, excuse me, I foreshadowed this already. I mentioned to you, 23 minutes ago, the idea that if you declare a blockade, you have declared war. That is the law of the international law. Lincoln has declared a blockade. That is a declaration of war against essentially the southern states. Problem, Article 1 of the Constitution, congressional powers. Only Congress can declare war. The president can't declare war. Only Congress can declare war. And so the Supreme Court was faced with a fascinating question of presidential powers. Can the president unilaterally declare war when the Constitution says that's Congress's job? Now, why is it that Congress didn't make the job easy and simply declare war? Congress could have declared war. Why did they do it? You only declare war against sovereign countries. The South, the last thing you wanted to do was to suggest they were a sovereign country. No, they're the United States. They just happen to be run by a bunch of scuffleballs. So Congress did not want to declare war because it'd be essentially a recognition of the validity of the southern states. Lincoln had to do this on his own. So here's the problem. What exactly is presidential commander-in-chief powers mean? We know he can't declare war because that's left under Article 1 to Congress. So here's the analogy I use in my class. Suppose tomorrow Canada gets really mad at us. And so thousands of Canadian troops riding moose come across the Windsor Bridge, invade Michigan. Congress is out, raising money or something. Does the president have to sit there and do nothing? Or does the president, under his commander-in-chief power, have the authority to fight back at least until Congress comes along? Or do we have to sit here and be forced to drink good beer as the Canadians come across them? Well, that's what the court said. There's a distinction here between Congress's power to declare war and the president's power as commander-in-chief. In the prize cases, the court said what Lincoln did seizing the ships was appropriate because the commander-in-chief power does give the president unilateral authority, doesn't need Congress's permission to fight back. If U.S. the United States or our interests are attacked, we can fight back, or the president can unilaterally fight back. But if we're going to pick the fight, if we're going to throw the first haymaker, then only Congress can do that. And so the word war under our Constitution, the court says during the Civil War, all turns on who picked the fight, who threw the first punch. And because the South threw the first punch by bombing Fort Sumter, the president had the unilateral authority to respond, to fight back. But again, if we're going to be the aggressor, then it takes Congress to declare it. Now this creates a real problem for the courts, by the way. So, anybody here had a good playground fight back when they were a kid? Who started it? Oh, he did. Oh, no, he didn't. You called him a bad name. Yeah, but he threw the first punch. Yeah, but you kicked him. Yeah. I've never started a fight in my life. When I was a kid, I was in 4 or 5 of them. Never started one of them, right? So one of the challenges the courts have in these cases is deciding whether we threw the first punch and therefore only Congress can start it, or whether the president was simply responding. Think Kosovo, Clinton, 30,000 bombing missions in Kosovo. Is that declaring war, or were our interests attacked? Well, what do you do about Afghanistan? Did they attack us first? I mean, I understand that the ISIS and Al Qaeda attacked us. Did the president have authority to bomb there? Who started the fight? Syria. Does the president have the authority to bomb Syria in the next couple of days? Did Syria attack us? I don't know. I don't know. One of the questions that remains open. When's the last time we had a good declared war? World War II. Whoa, wait, Schindler, what about the Korean War? What about the Vietnam War? What about the Afghan War? What about the Iraq War? What about the Iran War? What about the Grenada War? What about the Syria? Can I go on? Where the president shot first, he was responding to hostility. At least that's his argument. Or Congress has ultimately authorized it by paying for it. One of the great checks in my mind has been destroyed, in part, understand, I love Lincoln, by the way, but and he did what he had to do. I'm not criticizing Lincoln in any way, shape, or form, but that precedent continues on to reverberate today. Every president that gets into a scuffle off with somebody cites Lincoln as authority for the authority to send military troops in. So the war's not over. It continues to resonate in the decisions presidents make to this day. The ships were sold, by the way. Lincoln won that one because he was responding to hostility. Then finally, I want to move away from the cases and talk about Antietam. How Antietam is a pivot point in the history of the United States. Now, you're going to have, I understand, a park ranger come in. God, this sounds like so much fun. I'll talk to you about the actual battle. And oh, by the way, it's fascinating. It's a really, really interesting battle if you're into the strategic, oh, I'm joking, George Bush. If you're into the strategy, the tactics side of this, it's a really fascinating piece of history. The decisions made by the various generals, the fact that McClellan waited 18 hours after he was handed Lee's battle plan. There's a lot of really interesting stuff for us armchair generals in the whole battle. And you are so blessed to go on that hallowed ground. Bloodiest day in American history. Lincoln needed a win. Lincoln needed a win. September 17th, 1862, 52 miles from Washington. The war was not going well for the North. Battle of Bull Run, I could go down the list. We were losing battle after battle. Many of the northern folks were getting tired of, war. Their sons were being sent off and dying in a war where we just kept losing. Federal troops had been driven out of Virginia by Robert E. Lee. We were no longer on the aggression. The South was pushing into U.S. federal territory, invading Maryland. Imagine that. A foreign force 52 miles from Washington, and you haven't shown the ability to beat them. The press was attacking Lincoln viciously about this. We'd just come off a disastrous loss at the Second Bull Run. Terrible loss. Terrible loss. And at this point, Lincoln had decided to emancipate the slaves. Let me give you a slide in a minute that illustrates this. But the point being, Lincoln was ready to change the focus of the war entirely, away from simply preserving the Union to a higher moral ground. The idea that this war was not just about keeping us together as one people, but bringing us together truly as one people by eliminating slavery. But he couldn't do it because he didn't have the political capital. He needed a win to change this war from a war about unity to a war about true unity. The South needed a win too. The European nations were poised to recognize the Confederacy, which would have been a disaster for the North. Because if you bring in the great powers of Britain and France, giving aid to the South, starting to buy cotton, breaking through the blockade, which they largely had agreed to, or not agreed to, but largely had not tried to break. Suddenly the South has got money, it's got troops, it's got weapons, it's got another Navy, potentially the British Navy, stopping the blockade. If the European nations recognize that the South is a sovereign country, at this point they hadn't, then we're likely going to lose the war. Lee felt if I got one more big victory, punch the North in the nose real hard, the European nations are going to recognize us, whereupon we win the war. Robert Lee was quoted, and I'm paraphrasing, believing that one more successful campaign after a series of victories would end the war and we'd be forever two countries. Both sides needed a big win here, people. That's why Antietam is such a critical battle in the history of the United States. People like to talk about Gettysburg as being the big battle, and I'm not minimizing Gettysburg, also hallowed ground. This was every bit as big. Well, I will let the, as much as I want to go there because it's really fun for me, but I will let the park ranger tell you about the battle a little bit more. But let's just say it was considered a tactical victory for the United States, which means the South was forced to retreat. If you look at the numbers, it was really a tie. But it gave Lincoln enough political capital and moral courage, if you will, to change the entire footing of the war. From a battle over unity, the summer of 1862, remember, this battle was fought in September, he wrote a letter to Horace Greeley, famous newspaper man. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would. If I could do it by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could do it by freeing some and keeping others in bondage, I would do that. This is about one country, slavery be damned. But over time, Lincoln began to find that powerful moral compass that we know him for and said, you know, there's more going on here than simply unifying our country. It is time for us as a country to live up to those words and our very Declaration of Independence, the idea that we are a nation conceived in liberty. And so the Emancipation Proclamation for him was not simply a war effort. It was to reset, hit the reset button on the Civil War and saying we are fighting for something greater than simply being one country. We are fighting a moral crusade. And I am going to make this point by issuing an executive order, an Emancipation Proclamation, a proclamation of freedom. Okay, now the little stuff first. Constitutional? Fred Scott, still hanging out there, still good law. What power gives the president unilateral authority without congressional approval to free, as it turns out, 3 million out of the 4 million slaves? It's not in there. He claimed commander-in-chief power. Now, one of the misunderstandings about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it did not free all the slaves. It only freed the slaves in the country, in the states that were under rebellion. Lincoln knew that if he freed all the slaves in Maryland, which had gone for the North, Kentucky, which had largely gone for the North, Missouri, which had largely gone for the North, he would lose tremendous support. So it doesn't free the slaves in the 4 slave states that had called for the Union. It only frees the slaves in the states that had gone for the Confederacy. And in effect, they were under Confederate control. Didn't truly free anybody. It wasn't until we started taking over those states that true freedom occurred through military action. But the point was not so much whether it freed any slave at the moment. The point was to say this Civil War is about something much greater than simply our country. It's about the moral righteousness about who we are as a people. Who we are as a people. Likely unconstitutional, but thank God he did it. It's all about true freedom now, not just national unity. And Cheatham gave him the cover to do this remarkable thing. So when I think about the Civil War, folks, every time I turn on the news, I see the Civil War being refought. It redefined, through the 14th Amendment, what came after, the relationship between the people and the federal government, and the states and the federal government. It redefined our understanding of presidential powers. It redefined, most importantly, what we as a people believe our civil liberties and civil rights are. I remember during the bicentennial, 1976, I was 15 at the time, and they brought over a French philosopher, political philosopher, famous. Took him on tours and saw the USS Constitution, the boat, and all this sort of thing. At the end of this several months in the United States, watching all the celebrations, he was asked, so what do you think about this great American experiment, 200 years old? And his response was, too early to tell. Too early to tell because the things we fought over in the Civil War, freedom, liberty, the idea that we are all created equal in the eyes of our Creator, these fights continue to go on every day. So I would invite you, and I know many of you already are, become players in that battlefield as we continue to fight the fights of freedom began so long ago by our founders, restarted by our second set of founders, the Civil War that continues to resonate today. Thank you. I am happy to stick around for questions if anybody wants questions.
Well, thank you first, Professor Schindler, for coming in today. Does anybody have any questions?
And I'm happy to stick around too. If there's not a question or two, I'll feel like I completely failed. So somebody throw me a bone.
You probably know this, but I was going to ask you. So one of the things that I learned about when we were talking, what we talked about here a couple weeks ago, was when Lincoln was trying to decide when to come out with the Emancipation Proclamation, and Antietam was it. That wasn't his idea. It was actually the Secretary of State.
Yeah, the way that played out, great question. The way that played out is, Lincoln had gone back and forth with Secretary of State, among others, on, we really need, and there really is more of a moral element. There was also a geopolitical element to it. As part, and of course I had to shorten the story, but as the geopolitical unit on this was, remember the European nations who were all free. They'd gotten rid of slavery years before and considered it a real moral abomination. That's largely why they were staying out of the fight. We're beginning to sneak into the idea or raising the notion of actually recognizing the southern states, in part because they wanted the continent. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, essentially he threw the gauntlet down to the European nations, saying, we're not fighting for unity anymore, we're fighting for slavery. And if you recognize the sovereignty of the southern states, you are doing something immoral. And that really resonated in the British press at the time. It's like, wait, what are we talking about recognizing these states? The North is fighting for true freedom and, anti-slavery, after all, it turns out. We better stay out of this one. But the problem was, and this is the key, he announced it the previous summer that he was going to issue, that he wanted to issue the Emancipation. His cabinet was, split. Have you ever read, what's the name of the book about his cabinet? Yeah. Team of Geniuses or
Rivals.
Team of Rivals. Thank you. Hello, only read it 6 years ago. Team of Rivals. There was some split on that, but ultimately, the very consistent advice he got was, we need a victory. Because if you issue this after, all these terrible defeats, you have no capital. It'll look like the final dying cry of a desperate man. But if you do it after a victory, you're doing it in a transcendent way. It gives you that moral, political, already had the moral backing, moral, political, and military backing at that point to show. Not only are we doing this because it's the right thing, we can pull it off. That message had to come out. So that's why Antietam was such a critical battle for a lot of reasons for the North to win. It gave Lincoln, at that point his cabinet, with exceptions, said, okay, you got enough. Go ahead and let's issue this thing. It really did change the whole tenor of the war. If you read, I like original documents. So I read a lot of original 1861, 1862, 1863 newspapers. I'm a total geek that way. If you read the newspapers at the time and some of the diplomatic cables, I've read some of that stuff too. You really do see it has changed the tenor. Abolitionists were happy. The slaves that heard about it gave them a lot more incentive to escape and come over the northern lines, where they were put into military units and fought bravely and ably for the North. Or became Teamsters or whatever. So suddenly you have this massive influx of slaves saying, old days, before the emancipation, sorry guys, getting excited, before the emancipation, a escaped slave would show up and essentially would be held as contraband. The northern armies would simply, maybe put them to work, but essentially say, once this war is over, we're going to return you to your owners. You can't become part of the army, you're not free. And so it not only did it work as sort of this moral geopolitical function, it also worked because it suddenly gave the northern armies this huge influx of manpower and woman power, cooks and teamsters and brave soldiers. I mean, you read the histories of some of the African American units, and oh my God, the racism of the time, they were setting the front lines to die, and they did. So I get goosebumps talking about this stuff. It worked on so many levels. And because he only emancipated the slaves that were in the rebellion states, it kept Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and New Hampshire on our team. If you've tried to free all, every state, and gradually the states did it on their own, the 13th Amendment, we got to where we got there anyways. But as a master stroke of political genius, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a better one on your
Do
street.
you think Lincoln's death was what pushed us over the edge to get to the 13th Amendment? Because it didn't pass until after his death. Do you think that was...
I think more so the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
I think the 13th was going to happen one way or another.
gonna happen.
Yeah, well, and eventually the 14th. But I just got done reading both the autobiography and the biography of Grant, which goes through that Reconstruction era. And look, by the way, I've changed my mind about Grant. I always thought he was a great general. He was a great president, too, because he fought the KKK powerfully. But, during the Johnson administration, you had the radical Republicans still held power. Johnson, Tennessee governor, former, now president, he was kind of a slave guy in many ways. Northern, yes, I'll give him his due, but he was a lukewarm, at best, abolitionist. What's that?
Pro-Constitution.
That's true, and he actually vetoed the first civil rights law, believing it to be unconstitutional. Point being, I think Johnson was a train wreck, a terrible president. But I think what it did is embolden people, the radical Republicans in general, to come together and really push the 13th, 14th, and ultimately the 15th Amendments. Unfortunately, that spirit died. And the Democrats began taking more and more power. We had the second rise after Grant destroyed the KKK. He sent the troops. Thank God he sent the troops to destroy the KKK. We lost all of that momentum. The spirit of Lincoln, that momentum gradually died out, and we ended up with the KKK being reborn, at the turn of the century again, and then 80 more years. So a great piece of historical sort of fiction is the wrong word, but what would have happened if Lincoln would have survived? Unknown or unknowable. Judge?
In responding to the crisis, as Lincoln did back before Congress came back, is the fact that he was responding to an insurrection or a rebellion within the country from people that didn't like him, that he Did he have any police powers, or was there anything else that enhanced his ability to respond, as opposed to responding to a foreign state that was recognized as a foreign state?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is, if you, great question, Judge. Now I feel like I have to get this absolutely right, or you're going to rule against me. Federal power, very restricted. And if you look at the Constitution, the words police power never appear. And so when he read Article 2, all he had, he couldn't say take care, faithfully executed, because Congress hadn't authorized anything, and Congress was out. So all he had was commander-in-chief. And so what he did is he bootstrapped the notion that the commander-in-chief expands to all military, not just, foreign relations, foreign attacks. That any time there is, and there's actually support for that in Article 1, Section 9, which talks about the power of suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The Constitution embodies the notion that the federal government has authority to take, extra constitutional actions in times of insurrection, invasion, or rebellion. That language appears in Article 1, Section 9. So the president's powers, and I don't think there's any question about this, covers both invasion. This is not an invasion, because under laws, international law, you are only invaded by foreign sovereigns. But it also encompasses the notion to exercise the commander-in-chief powers to put down insurrections. So the answer to your question is, I don't see it as a police power, because the federal government doesn't have the police power. It belongs to the states. But boy, you can sure bootstrap commander-in-chief at that point, once you recognize that it covers both rebellions, and certainly Washington felt so. Whiskey Rebellion gave him commander-in-chief powers, and he led the army on that one, as you may recall. Going to Pennsylvania and bring down Doors Rebellion. There had been a history of the presidents responding to internal rebellions. So, in terms of that, certainly there was precedent for what he did. It makes sense? This has been great. Enjoy Antietam. I am jealous as all heck. Thank you again for inviting me, folks.
Again, thank you, Professor Schindler. Just a reminder, so we have 2 more weeks, of getting together. Next week will be Mr. Jim Buchanan, who is a former FJC instructor as well as a park ranger. So he'll be with us. He's flying in from DC to talk to you a little bit about Antietam. He actually has a personal tie to Antietam, which I'll let him talk to you about, but very compelling, very knowledgeable. He leads the FJC course for chief deputies and clerks. They got actually 2 sessions this year. So just a great resource, wonderful. I think you're really going to like him. And then the week after that, we'll have a wrap-up. And I think there's a group of us that are going to be in Marquette that week, but Jim Williams has graciously agreed to sort of do a wrap-up. And what that's going to mean is he's going to talk about some of the high points from all the discussions of Professor Schindler's lectures, the little bit that we were able to share with you about Lincoln, Michelle and I, what Jim talks about next week, Jim Buchanan. So just to wrap up, you'll probably want to be a part of that, because Jim Williams also is going to be sort of hosting the game show, yet to be sort of formulated, that we'll be doing on the bus on the way down. And we're going to have some wonderful, albeit inexpensive, gifts to commemorate your victory by getting the questions right. And so anyway, so we look forward to that as well. So the next 2 weeks, then we're off. We're off to DC, we're off to Antietam, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy what you're going to see there, because it's very moving. It's why Judge Onker asked us to put together this program. It's why he wanted to take the time to take you there, sort of recommit to this idea of federal service, what it means, and how we got here, and what it really means to the American people and to us as servants, of the American people. So anyway, thank you for that. See you next week.